Hello everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Azure On Air. Today we have an interesting guest, Kent Weare. He is a principal product manager at Microsoft. He is also an experienced leader who possesses strong technical skills and is very passionate about architecture with a specialty in integration. I'm very happy to have Kent today in our show.
And talk to a lot of consultants, a lot of customers, a lot of partners about what they're looking for from Microsoft in order to help customers make this transition from BizTalk to Azure Integration Services. Trying to automate every single scenario for every single adapter isn't something that scales really well. And so people are definitely looking for some help in this area, but they're not expecting the magic button. I think the magic button isn't realistic. The amount of custom code, I think that is kind of the sort of the biggest challenge today. And I think that's why there is some angst by customers, in terms of like, how do we deal with this? Hello, thank you for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting our invite. And yeah, Kent, let us tell the audience a bit more about you, what you are doing, and how did you land up in this field?
Sure, no, sounds good. So I've been in the integration space for most of my career.
Mm,
It goes back to, well, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but it goes back to BizTalk 2004. I started working with BizTalk in 2004 on BizTalk 2004. At the time, I was working for the Canadian federal government out in Hull, Quebec, and had this opportunity to learn the technology, and it actually has been quite it played a quite a big role in my career overall. It's created a lot of opportunities for me, and as a result, I've had a chance to kind of work in many different places. Had the opportunity to move to Calgary, where I currently reside, and start working with BizTalk in the energy space. I did a little bit of healthcare work with BizTalk out in British Columbia in Canada, and really had created a lot of opportunities for me. Back in probably 2015, I was heavily involved in the integration MVP community, the BizTalk MVP community, and there was this shift to cloud that was going on, and it was one of those things where, as an operations manager for integrations in the energy sector, it was starting to become a little bit cumbersome, sort of managing all of this infrastructure. And at that point, I started to focus more on cloud and where things were headed as opposed to where things were. Started to explore logic apps and Azure API management and service bus, and was able to actually create some customer stories on the Microsoft website based on real world stuff that we were doing. And so this really sort of created this pull to me to the cloud, was really more focused on how do I solve business problems as opposed to like the underlying plumbing per se. And
mm,
so from there, I started to get more involved in the cloud side of things. I did spend some time with Power Platform and trying to democratize who can go ahead and build out solutions, whether that's through automation or through Power Apps. At Microsoft, I spent a few years in the PowerCat team. It's the customer advisory team focused on RPA, so robotic process automation.
mm.
I spent a little bit of time on the product team, which was Microsoft Flow at that point. Now it's called Power Automate. And then this past March, I had the opportunity to join the Logic Apps team as a product manager. And it really was
Amazing.
a great opportunity and an opportunity to come back more to this space of integration. And yeah, that's kind of how I got here. That's how I got here.
That's a long run, I guess. Yeah. So having spoke about the BizTalk and through the journey to Azure that you had, so you might have faced a lot of customers on your way, right? So during, be it during migration or be it during just in BizTalk or just in cloud. So while you face the migration stage, so what are the challenges that you feel that the customers face today during the migration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I joined the Logic Apps team here in March, part of my charter was to take a look at the BizTalk migration to Azure Integration Services. So since March, I've spent a lot of time in this space, and talked to a lot of consultants, a lot of customers, a lot of partners about what they're looking for from Microsoft in order to help customers make this transition from BizTalk to Azure Integration Services. And so we've conducted a series of surveys. We've had a lot of interviews and also just sessions, whether that be with MVPs and with the Partner Advisory Council as well. And what we're seeing is that there's a big gap. I would call it a big sort of knowledge gap between BizTalk and Azure Integration Services. And what I mean by that is, people are very familiar with BizTalk, and it's pretty amazing just to see how much people do with BizTalk and how far they've taken it. And then we think about Azure Integration Services, and we know that the underlying platform is different. And I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Like we have,
Mm,
things to think about when we get to cloud, really around scalability and how do we support customers in like multiple regions and multiple geographies, and how do we go ahead and address that? And so what we're in general seeing is like there's a gap when it comes to architectural guidance. So almost like reference architecture, saying like I have this application in BizTalk, it looks like this, and maybe it's pub sub, right? So maybe we're doing the traditional things of having like inbound port mapping, creating a canonical message, publishing it to a message box, then having subscribers on that specific message type, whether that's orchestrations or whether that's send ports. And now, how do we go ahead and do this in the cloud, right? So there
mm,
is no message box in Azure Integration Services. Now, we do have Service Bus, and Service Bus is part of the Azure Integration Services offering itself that gives you pub sub capability. So it's super important when you think about these migration scenarios. It's not necessarily, well, like what is this feature? It's more about capabilities. And when you
mm,
think about this stuff, is it capable of doing it? Because it will be different. Like you're not going to see pub sub in Logic Apps, right? We have Service Bus that can go ahead and do that. So I think that's, I would call it number one. And then if I go through just maybe a couple more here,
yeah.
people are looking for migration tooling that aid in moving assets from BizTalk to Azure. Now we do have a tool today, and it some people have checked it out, and it's one of those things where, as we think more about it, we are rethinking what's the best way to use this tool, because
Mm,
there are some realities when moving these workloads. Like I said, it's not just this like for like. There is some element of like re-architecture in terms of how you would go about doing it. So trying to automate every single scenario for every single adapter isn't something that scales really well. And so people are definitely looking for some help in this area, but they're not expecting the magic button. I think the magic button isn't realistic, but we do want to help customers in here. And I think,
mm,
as we think about the BizTalk migration tool moving forward, we want to see how we can just provide the most value to customers. And maybe that's more through like just inventory and then pointing them at practical guidance of how you would go about doing so.
mm,
That's something that people are looking for. So this is in a emerging space. We are committed to doing some more work from a migration tooling. It might look a little bit different than it does today, but we
mm,
we definitely see the need to really help customers in this space. And then maybe if there's one more thing I could talk about is the number sort of three need that we had from customers is really just around strategy documentation. And sometimes this
mm,
is more about those business decision makers and how they can position this upgrade or this movement, this transition, within their organization itself, right? So not just about the technical implementation, which is obviously super important here, but what are the business impacts of this? Like, what as a customer can we expect by moving
mm,
to the cloud? Can we increase agility? Can we reduce the time to value? How do we sort of position this self, to our organization? Because is some investment that has to be made here, and people want to understand like what is like the return on that investment, and how can they go about thinking about these types of workload movements.
yeah. So that was a very clear explanation from your end regarding to what I spoke right now. So I would also like to know, since you spoke about that benefits and other things that Azure Integration Services carry on. So, what would be the gaps between BizTalk and Azure Integration Services? Can you just throw some light on that?
For sure. I think, as we talk to customers, and this probably comes as no surprise to people, but it was a good reminder for myself. Like, obviously, I've done a lot of biz talk in the past, not as much recently, but the amount of custom code, I
Mm,
think that is kind of the sort of the biggest challenge today. And I
yeah,
think that's why there is some angst by customers, in terms of like, how do we deal with this? Because if we think about custom code, like, obviously it's kind of something that is necessary in many regards. Like, whenever organizations, companies create iPaaS platforms, obviously you want to have, rich features, rich capabilities out of the box. But the reality is that when you're an integration developer, you get that kind of like, you figure it out, just like make sure it works kind of a thing, right? And so when you're in those situations with that project manager and you've got tight timelines and you need sort of an extensibility capability, you're going to look to custom code because that's where you have the most control. So if we
yeah,
look at BizTalk and where you can go ahead and use custom code, you can obviously create assemblies. You can call those assemblies from expression shapes. You can also do some level of inline C sharp in expression shapes. We also have the BizTalk maps, which is very popular place to use the scripting functoid, where once again you can go ahead and reach out to a custom assembly, or you can do inline code within there as well. We have custom pipeline components, where there's naturally a lot of custom code being written as well, and then we also get a little bit into the BizTalk rules engine and the ability to add custom code to your policies.
mm,
So that, as you sort of think about these large implementations, there's generally a lot of custom code, and you can go ahead and basically do a lot of things with that custom code. And so I think if we think about AIS and where we're currently at, custom code, we do have support naturally through functions, but we've got feedback from customers that we don't always want to have to do that, where we're going to go ahead and have to provision another service and then have to manage that separately. Obviously, there's a time and place for functions, so it still might be the right fit in many regards. But if people are wanting to do more, say, inline code, or the ability to call this custom code from maps inside of Logic App Standard, I think those would be some of the key areas that we need to address to make that transition smoother for customers.
yeah. So that's indeed something very important to make the transition very smooth for customers. That's the key perspective that migration should deal with. Yeah. So, having that note, so what are the prerequisites or what are the checklists that a particular customer should make while migrating from BizTalk to Azure? So, these are the things they should be aware of, or they should make sure that they already make a decision regarding that. What are the prerequisites and checklist, Kent?
Yeah, and so this is a great point. And so this is something that we are already working on. So probably by the time this recording comes out, we should have something to share. But this is super important. I think this is another ask that customers have, is
Mm,
being able to understand, like, how do they go about basically moving these workloads to the cloud. And so what we are is we're putting out a BizTalk migration architecture guidance document,
mm,
and within this we're going to have a checklist in terms of the things that you should be thinking about. And so, just to name a few, obviously we talked a little bit about custom code. I think that's super
yeah.
important, and as a result, I think you want to have some sort of an inventory around these things so that you can plan accordingly. And I think that's where that migration tools, that's kind of how we're going to pivot it and have it more
Mm,
focused on this. But if we think about, custom code is one, web services and API connectivity. Naturally, inside of BizTalk, you're probably dealing more so with SOAP-based services. You might have some REST services versus Logic Apps, where you've got, you know, predominantly REST and JSON as first-class citizens. I think the network connectivity is something that people really need to take stock of. So if you think about BizTalk, most likely it's running locally in your data center. Maybe you're running it inside Azure, like within a VNet, which is more or less acting like it's on-prem in many regards. So thinking about that, and then thinking about, well, if I go with Logic Apps, and especially standard, we've got some opportunities to connect to VNets that gives you
mm,
that on-premises feel, or the ability to use a private endpoint for other people to access your Logic app. So that's a pretty big consideration. Security and governance is something that should not be overlooked. Once again, it's, if we're moving this to the cloud, what are the things we should be doing? So for one, it might be around you're protecting your HTTP triggers and using something like EasyAuth to help sort of add an authentication layer, or maybe it's around using Azure API management to basically proxy those requests into your Logic apps as well. That's a big one. And then I think the monitoring is another huge thing, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
it might be very different between how you operate your BizTalk environment versus how you will operate in the cloud, and that's definitely something that you should be considering as well.
Yes, yes.
And
So
then I'd say, just in terms of project execution, I think this is pretty important too, and this is and so I think this is where it's important just to go through this as well. And I think, as I mentioned before, probably the number one challenge people have is that knowledge gap. And so, in my mind, this is where using more of an iterative approach, I think it would be good for customers. And I think even taking like a greenfield, like a brand new scenario, and rolling out with Logic Apps first might be advisable before you start moving the BizTalk assets over. And I think the idea behind that is just getting familiar with Azure and basically the governance model and the identity and access control, and being able to sort of use the IDE and the tools and the deployment, and doing something that may not be on the critical path, so that you have the time to do it properly. You have the time to go ahead and learn and understand what you're doing. And then once you're comfortable, then increase your velocity, then start to roll these things out faster and faster and faster. I think using a big bang approach or a waterfall approach wouldn't be the best idea here, because learning from like kind of like your lessons learned, or best practices, are something that you're going to develop internally, even beyond what we publish, and being able to take advantage of those lessons learned for additional interfaces, I think is super important. So I'd be thinking about those things as well.
yeah. So as you rightly mentioned, that monitoring is another key part, that be it a cloud solution or an on-premise solution, monitoring is definitely an integral part to be noted to. Yeah. So having that in hand, I would like to have a quick roadmap for of Azure Integration Services for BizTalk customers who are planning for migration, so that would be another push for them to go ahead for migration.
Yeah, so at the Integrate conference that happened just in June here, Ballin, our product director, gave the keynote. And as part of the keynote, he did have a slide that outlined our investments in this area. So this is really around like BizTalk migration. What are the investments we need to make as a product group to help BizTalk customers move their workloads? And so what we did is we called it out in three buckets: short term, medium term, and longer term. And so, in the shorter term bucket, let's start there. The areas that we had identified here was content, so patterns of practices. So, one of those pieces is the document I mentioned, really that architectural guidance and giving customers some reference patterns that they can use from that perspective. Then we also discussed .NET framework support. And this is all in within the context of Logic App Standard. We really are prioritizing Logic App Standard because it is the most enterprise ready SKU for customers to be using. And so by .NET Framework support, the ability to include assemblies, especially in the context of BizTalk maps, so that you should be able to take your BizTalk maps and then go ahead and call out to these assemblies as well. And then we'll see how far we can take it. I don't want to go make too many promises in this area, but it kind of goes back to the code, the custom code, as being an important pillar here, and how do we best support customers. So we will be looking to address as many of those needs as we can, and as we have more details to share, we'll certainly be doing so. And then lastly, within the short-term bucket, Swift support. So this is something where customers are looking to support the Swift protocol inside of Azure Logic Apps. Some of this work is underway, and you should see some more info later this year, early next year from that perspective. But this is actively being worked on. Now, next up, we've got medium term. And so, medium term, meaning like we still need to go ahead and prioritize these investments when we get to our next semester. And so, we've got, I guess some of the stuff is underway as well, but like we've got some improvements coming to EDI and integration account enhancements. And so, I think those will be welcome for customers. And then we get into areas that will be very important for BizTalk. So, native XML support, WCF/SOAP support. And this goes back to one of the sort of key pain points, I would say, just in terms of, BizTalk, when it was, built, it was, built around like the WCF stack and .NET stack, and SOAP was kind of the web service, choice of flavor of the day. And now we're seeing that there's more JSON and REST, but that doesn't matter. Like if customers need to move those assets up, how do we best support them? So we will make some investments in the areas of XML and SOAP support so that customers can bring those services forward to the cloud. Because what we really want to do here is we want to unblock customers and at least allow them to bring their existing assets forward. And then once they're in AIS, if they do want to modernize their stack, obviously they're welcome to do so. Or maybe it's like whenever they do something new, then take advantage of REST and JSON. But we know that it's not practical or feasible for people to have to do that as part of the migration. So, how do we really then unblock the migration and then give people the ability to further invest after the fact? Next up is the BizTalk rules engine support. And so the goal here would be for you to take your BizTalk rules engine policies and then have the ability to go ahead and execute them. We do anticipate that you would still continue to use the BizTalk rules engine composer to go ahead and design your policies, at least at this point in time. And then lastly, within this medium term bucket, we'll have the BizTalk migration tool refresh. As I mentioned before, we're going to take another look at this to see how to best service customers as they move their assets from BizTalk over to Azure. And then lastly, but not least, when we think about longer term investments, really business event tracking. And so obviously inside of BizTalk, you've got BAM, business activity monitoring. This won't necessarily be like a like for like replacement, but from a capability perspective, we want to ensure that customers have the ability to go ahead and instrument business events, be able to track them, and then give some sort of self service experience in terms of viewing that data itself.
Thank you, Kent, for the exciting roadmap that you revealed to us. We are so excited to look on to what Microsoft has got for us in terms of stock migration to Azure. Yeah. So, what would be a quick tip for your BizTalk users who are planning for an Azure migration?
Yeah, I think in this area, the best thing that people can do is really play or experiment with Azure Logic App Standard. I think that's probably the area that people should be focusing on the most, especially in the interim, as we continue to make these investments. But we will see these investments land inside of Logic App Standard. So that would be my recommendation is really to go ahead. If you're not familiar with Logic App Standard, get familiar with the feature set. I would also say go ahead and look at some of the more sort of infrastructure related items like around security and governance and deployment, because those will be super important as you get closer to your migration. So, and then I guess following that is just really look for additional guidance that we will publish. Like I said, it should be out by the time this recording is made available, and I would check that out. And then lastly, if you are interested in more info on Logic App Standard, if you want to go ahead and check out my YouTube channel, just youtube.com/Kent Weare. I typically go ahead and discuss these latest features related to standard, and there should be some good information there as you get more familiar with those capabilities.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So, apart from being an tech enthusiast, you are also a great YouTuber. Just now I got to know about that. That's nice to hear. And yeah, thank you for joining us today in this session, Kent. It was an amazing session where you threw a lot of highlights, and we are really excited to know about the roadmap as well. That which gave us more encouragement, which would eventually turn on the encouragement, or the boost the customers who are listening, or the listeners who are listening to our show. So they might, if they are in a plan to move to Azure, or from BizTalk to Azure, then this podcast would be great help for them. So thank you for showing us what the roadmap is and what Microsoft has got for us. Thank you.
Cove.co